Afternoon, everyone, or good day to everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to ESMARConf2023, and this is workshop 10, how the FEAT framework can help you select study appraisal tools suitable for your systematic review. This workshop is being live streamed to YouTube and has a group of participants taking part live, and really warm welcome to all of you. If you have any questions for our presenters, you can ask them via the ESMARConf Twitter account by commenting on the tweet about this workshop. If you register for the workshop, you can also ask a question in the Q&A in Zoom. And also you can comment and chat with the other participants on our dedicated Slack channel, which was sent along with your registration information. We'll try and answer all the questions as soon as we can. In addition, we'd like to just draw your attention to our code of conduct, which is available on the ESMARConf website at www.esmarconf.org. So go and have a look at that. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Geoff and Paul to take you through this workshop. Thank you, guys. Welcome.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome along to this workshop. It's great to have you here. I do apologise, we had a few technical hitches. I guess no surprise, and that's why we're just a little bit late starting. Fingers crossed we won't have technical hitches for the remainder of this workshop. One of the things I'd like to have done is to invite you to say where you've come and joined us from around the world, which would be quite interesting. We weren't able to put a poll in for that, but if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be great. So we have an idea about where you've come from, which organisations you work for. So today we're going to be talking about the FEAT principles. Now, you may well have never heard of these. There's something that probably it's a relatively new principle, so you may well have not heard of them. And I'm going to talk about how these principles can help you to select study appraisal tools when you're conducting a systematic review. And so we'll tell you what the FEAT principles are, and we'll go through a worked example of a critical appraisal tool in applying these principles. So before we do that, just a bit of an introduction. So Paul, would you just like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. So I've worked with Geoff for quite a long time. I think we first met at CE 2016, 2015, something like that. So I'm a research methodologist. I work in the environmental health space, so understanding the impact of the environment in which people live on their health. I do research methods in that space. I advocate for open science practices, and I do quite a lot of work around publishing standards, particularly in my role as a editor-in-chief of a new open science journal, evidence-based toxicology. And then my experience in systematic review comes from being systematic reviews editor at Environment International for 7 years, which I was doing till autumn last year, where I handled over 450 submission types. And I can say confidently that critical appraisal is one of the most challenging areas that my submitting authors would have to deal with. So I think this FEAT framework that really Geoff initiated, we're hoping will be really, really useful for helping people who are doing systematic reviews kind of overcome some of these issues.
Thanks, Paul. So just to say who I am, I work at Southampton University here in the UK. In an academic unit called Southampton Health Technology Assessment Centre, and we have expertise in critically appraising company drug submissions for the health regulator here, which is called the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. So we do a lot of critical appraisal of evidence. But prior to joining this particular academic group, I have a long-ish sort of history based on my PhD many years ago, which was in the area of ecotoxicology, looking at the impact of farming systems on the environment, particularly regarding pesticides. So I've got quite a lot of environmental experience in my background. And so I've kind of fused my primary research in the environment with my more recent health technology evidence synthesis research together. And I'm actively involved with the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which is developing guidelines and standards in the area of environmental evidence. So that's why I have an interest in this area. And I would agree with Paul that critical appraisal is quite a complex and challenging part of the process of evidence appraisal. So hopefully we'll make a bit of an improvement on that this afternoon if all goes well. So the first question we'd like to ask is, have you actually done any critical appraisal? And there's a poll link in the chat thread, but if you've got a smartphone or a tablet, and you can read a QR code fairly quickly, you can have a quick point at the screen. And we would love to hear whether you've actually had any experience with critical appraisal. And hopefully the answer will be yes. Otherwise, we have to explain the very basics, which could take months. But it'll be interesting to see. So have a go, and then we'll pitch this workshop at the level of experience that's appropriate.
So I think this is looking pretty encouraging, Geoff.
Do we have an idea of how many people have voted in the poll? Because my screen, 5 people. Yeah, I think a few more people could. Yeah, that's it. We're going up now. Be honest, and be very honest if you're not sure. If you've done some kind of a scientific assessment involving appraising evidence and you're not really sure whether it's critical appraisal, that's absolutely fine to admit. It's just useful to know what people's experience is.
Yeah, if you want to type anything to kind of expand on the answer you gave, I'm sitting here observing the chat while Geoff presents, and I will jump in with questions and issues and things as they arise. So just don't be shy of using the chat box. I think the popcorn stopped popping, Geoff.
Okay, so the good news is that most of us are familiar with having done some sort of critical appraisal, so that's great. Hopefully those of you who haven't will understand and appreciate what critical appraisal is and what the challenges are. But if you get stuck anywhere along the lines, pop something in the chat thread and we'll try and help you out. Okay. But for those of you who have done critical appraisal, one word, please, on how we would describe it. What's your experience? One word.
We have painful in the chat.
Painful? Is that somebody said something painful? Or
that's in the chat. No.
Yeah. I can relate to those words so far. So yeah. Yes, that's the word I would use, I think. Be honest.
I wonder if frustrating is going to get up there.
Nobody's put the word easy. Nobody's put the word very straightforward. Nobody's put the word quick. Yeah, difficult.
So Geoff, we've got about 12 live participants, so I think we're probably
So that just basically reinforces what I think Paul was saying. Our experience is that it's not easy, is it, critical appraisal? And so and there are various reasons why it's not easy, and we could spend the rest of the year probably discussing what those are, but obviously we've only got a short time this afternoon, so we'll focus on some specific reasons that critical appraisal is challenging and try and help with those. So why are we developing a framework for assessing appraisal tools? Well, obviously, critical appraisal is a crucial part of a systematic review. It's absolutely essential that we know that any of the studies in the review are biased so that we can take that into account in our data synthesis. So we need to have some kind of a critical appraisal step in a systematic review. So that's pretty straightforward. The problem is that many published systematic reviews don't have a critical appraisal stage at all, or they don't have an appraisal stage that's very clear. So we don't necessarily trust their conclusions. And there's a set of references at the end of this slideshow giving you some information about some of the problems in systematic reviews that have been published recently. with regarding to critical appraisal. So I won't go into the great detail here. But one of the key problems that we find with critical appraisal is how do we choose which critical appraisal tools to use, which I'll be coming on to. But Paul, your experience in this area is that environmental health systematic reviews are not particularly strong. Is that right?
Yeah, so we've done 2 bits of research on this. We looked at a set of 75 environmental health systematic reviews that were published in the first half of 2020. And we were looking at how well they'd been done, looking for kind of 11 basic methodological features that should be included in any systematic review. One of these was a critical appraisal step. And we found that while critical appraisal was quite common to be done, so it was done, I can't remember off the top of my head, like in 80% of the systematic reviews we looked at, only 11 of the 75 systematic reviews that we had in our sample had used an appraisal process that seemed to be at least superficially valid. So definitely difficult for people to choose and apply tools. And then if you just progress one more. So the other thing we've got is that while at Environment International, we use an online appraisal tool so we can record the reasons why we're desk rejecting systematic review manuscripts that we receive. And 85% of the systematic reviews we received at the journal, we were having to send back for at least revision prior to peer review. So it'd be like either to redo the risk of bias assessment or reanalyze it or do it at all. So that was happening with 85%, excuse me, of the submissions that we received. So again, it shows that, you know, more than 4 times out of 5, we've got authors who are finding the critical appraisal step of systematic review quite challenging.
So one of the big challenges, and this is a focus on the problems, because obviously there are other problems with critical appraisal, but one of the key things is how to account for all of the risks of bias, all of the threats to validity that we need to assess in a systematic review for the particular studies of design that we're interested in. And as we are aware, I think most of us have been involved in critical appraisal, there are many tools available. And there are many tools available, especially for observational studies. There's long lists that you can find if you just Google critical appraisal or risk of bias assessments. But the problem is which ones of these are robust, which ones are suitable for use, and therefore which ones should we choose? And so what we'd like to do in this workshop is to try and help you along with that process using the FEAT principles, which we will explain. But just another one of these quick questions is, which critical appraisal tools have you used so far? And if you've used multiple tools, please list whichever ones you've used. If you've used a self-made tool because no other appropriate tool was available, just say homemade. It'll be just good to see which tools people have used in real life. Homemade, yeah. Circle risk of bias tool, yeah. If you have used a homemade tool, maybe you could just say quickly in the chat why you used a homemade tool. Was it because there was no tool for the study design or the review question that you had in mind? Perhaps that might be interesting to hear.
Yeah, so I think we found, Geoff, in the research that we did, that people using homemade tools about 10-12% of the time, maybe, roughly, or a lot more in terms of this particular sample.
It's a small sample size. We shouldn't get carried away.
Very small sample size, yeah.
N equals 3 so far.
So we definitely have at least one environmental health scientist there as well, because the Circle risk of bias tool is for preclinical trials using animal models. Okay,
well, don't worry if you're feeling a little bit shy or you can't remember what the tool was, or you're just too embarrassed because you invented one for some embarrassing reason that I don't know. Let's look at which tools are available and which have been used. So here's just an example of a couple of recent studies. So one was published in 2018, one was published last year, that were looking at the range of critical appraisals tools that have been used. And these are just examples from a couple of areas. So this particular study was looking at systematic reviews on medical interventions. And this particular study was looking at environmental health systematic reviews. And the key thing that we'd like to flag up here is that, look, there's a wide range of tools available on the x-axis. We don't need to worry about what they are. It's a little bit small, some of this text. But the key thing we'd like to flag up here is that there's one particular tool for non-randomized studies that is used more frequently than all the others, and that is the Newcastle Scale. And you can see that it's clearly the most frequently used critical appraisal tool in both these studies. And another recent study published in 2019, and all of these have got references at the end of the slide set if you want to go into detail and read them up. So the references are all there. This particular study looked at a random sample of non-Cochrane review protocols in the Prospero database to look at the intended appraisal tools that people were planning to use. And we have a data set here for several years, which is always quite interesting, but you can see yet again, for some curious reason, the Newcastle Scale is right up there as the most frequently intended tool to be used. And other more recently developed tools have started to get a bit of a prominence, like the Cochrane Robbins eye tool, but NOS is very, very popular. So that's something we like to flag up. And so based on this being a very widely used and popular tool, we'd like to, in this workshop, we'd like to rate this tool, NOS, against the FEAT criteria, the FEAT principles, which we will explain. So that's just some background as to why we're going to use the Newcastle Scale in this workshop. So what we'd like to do today is, obviously we all benefit from this, so there's some learning objectives for all of us. The first thing is to just understand what the FEAT principles are. So we'll explain those. And then how do we appraise critical appraisal tools? I mean, maybe you'll learn some new things here. Hopefully you will. We'll dissect the Newcastle Scale and see if there's anything about the scale that we need to know and apply to other tools. And as a result of this exercise, our intention is that we should come away with a better understanding of the limitations that there are in critical appraisal tools, based on this example of a common tool being the Newcastle Scale. So there's some objectives, and we can look back on these at the end of the workshop and see whether we've actually reached these or not. And there's a little bonus, and that is at the end of the exercise, there'll be an opportunity to contribute to a manuscript with us if you're interested. But I'm not going to say any more about that now, because I want you to stay and watch the rest of the presentation. So that's a carrot for you to keep watching. Okay, so we need to know what the FEAT principles are. Essentially, they are overarching, topic-independent core principles that are the necessary features of any critical appraisal. So if any one of these principles is missing or inadequate, then the critical appraisal will not appropriately be able to inform the data synthesis of a systematic review. So the important point is that these are very high-level overarching principles that are just good practice in evidence synthesis. They're topic independent, and as such, they're quite powerful because you can apply them to almost any situation. And what we've done is we've just highlighted them, really. So these are existing principles of good practice, and we've just decided that it's important that they're highlighted so that we are aware of them, that we're aware of this good practice that needs to be employed in critical appraisal. But the other aspect of this is we've tried to make sure that the FEAT principles are very memorable. We've made this a short acronym, FEAT, so that we remember it, so make life easier when we come across critical appraisal tools. Because I think hopefully when you go through this exercise, you'll realize that actually they're keeping things a bit simple is more powerful than having long checklists. We've got so many checklists in evidence synthesis. We could make this into a massive checklist exercise looking at critical appraisal tools, and we'd be confused. This hopefully is to simplify it a bit and make it memorable and intuitive. But if it doesn't work, we'd be interested to know. So it'd be interesting to get your feedback as well. So the FEAT principles have been introduced in this paper which we published in Environmental Evidence last year. which we also included in this paper. We also suggest an overall framework for how to conduct critical appraisal, which is based on these principles. So this was a joint exercise with a number of people, including Paul and myself were involved, but also many other people developed this over several years. It was more than 5 years it took us to thrash out ideas and put this together. So that's the source, the key source paper, if you want to find out more about the principles. Okay, so that's where we are with what the principles are. Are the principles being used by anybody? They're quite new. We only published the paper last year, and the answer is there is some optimism that they're useful. They're being taken up by people. So the FEAT principles have been included in the latest version of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidences Guidelines and Standards for Evidence Synthesis in Environmental Management. So you'll be able to find the guidelines and standards there that sort of incorporate these FEAT principles. And these guidelines and standards in turn inform the author guidelines for the journal Environmental Evidence. The FEAT principles have also been incorporated when Paul was working at Environment International at the journal, in the triage of systematic review submissions, and also in the new evidence-based toxicology journal, which Paul is the editor-in-chief of, and also in a tool for triaging editorial submissions for peer review relating to evidence synthesis. Is there anything else you'd like to say on that, Paul, about those sources?
Well, I think it's a slightly deceptive end, right? Because it's like one of the developers of FEAT is using it everywhere. But I think one of the things I really like about FEAT is how much it helps me when I'm editing and I'm, triaging manuscripts and things, to understand how to have a framework that helps me develop appraisal tools of various different types, the various different tasks I have to do as an editor, the different types of manuscript I receive. It's incredibly helpful. So it continues to be helpful to the editors at Environment International now after I've left. We built it into a number of critical appraisal tools. And I think that's really all I need to say on that.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So that's where to look out for the principles. So let's explain what the principles actually are. And so there are 4 principles, and they form the acronym FEAT. And the reason they form this acronym FEAT is to make it memorable, so that we can be looking at a critical appraisal tool. We can, it's intuitive to know what to look for. We find that really helpful. We find the idea of having a very long checklist with hundreds of questions not easy to work with in this kind of complex situation. Simplification is the buzzword we like if it achieves a useful output. So that's why we've kept this down to 4 principles that are really important, we think. So the first principle, focused, is that the critical appraisal exercise must be focused on a particular construct of interest. So what we'll be talking about in this workshop is specifically internal validity. That is a really important construct that we need to include in a systematic review. But because the FEAT principles are very high-level overarching principles, you could include almost any constructs that you want. But in a systematic review, we're particularly interested in internal validity. So that's the focus principle. There has to be a clear focus of the assessment. The next principle, E, FEAT, is about the assessment being adequately extensive. So having decided that we have a clear construct of interest, we then need to make sure that we assess all the relevant components of that construct. It doesn't make sense to assess a construct and then leave half of the components out, have gappy data and missing information. So extensive is important. And as we'll see in this workshop, this is potentially the most challenging part of critical appraisal and systematic reviews, making sure that the appraisal is adequately extensive when regarding internal validity assessments. And then the next one of the FEAT principles is that the principles need to be applied. So in other words, you do critical appraisal and you've got to then use that critical appraisal in some way. Otherwise, it's a waste of time doing it. And the applied principle states that the appraisal must inform the data synthesis in an appropriate way. And it may sound blindingly obvious, but when you look at many systematic or so-called systematic reviews, meta-analyses in the literature. They don't even have a critical appraisal step. But from the perspective of critical appraisal tools, the output of the tool has to inform the data synthesis in an appropriate way. And then the final principle, T, is all about transparency. The appraisal must be transparent. I mean, it goes without saying almost. This is almost a very high level principle, being transparent, but clearly explained and justified decisions are crucial in critical appraisal, as with all steps of a systematic review. Okay, so those are the 4 principles, FEAT, FEAT. And I'll just go through them again now quickly, just to reinforce them, because these are, as I say, probably new to you and you won't instantaneously remember them. So here we go. Focus, just a reminder, the appraisal must be focused on the construct of interest. In a systematic review, this is going to be internal validity. Now, you could be interested in multiple constructs. You could be interested in whether a study follows ethics guidelines, or whether a study follows specific regulatory standards, whether the study is well reported. That's fine, you can assess those constructs, but you must, in a systematic review, also have a sense of the internal validity. So you must assess that construct. Okay, so that's an important focus, we would say, in a systematic review, to assess the internal validity of the studies that you include in the review. So what kind of issues could potentially come up here is a question worth asking when we have critical appraisal tools. Well, one obvious one is that you have a critical appraisal tool that just doesn't actually target internal validity. So that's a tool that may say it's a risk of bias tool, but doesn't actually measure risk of bias. And that's a potential problem. Another problem is that a tool may be described as a quality assessment tool, which is all very well, but what does quality mean? Does that mean it's focusing on internal validity or something else? And then another problem that we could come up with regarding the focus of a critical appraisal tool is that it might just be mixing up multiple constructs in one output. So that's not a good idea, because we really do need to know about internal validity when we come to our data synthesis. And if it's muddled up with reporting standards and other aspects of study conduct that don't have an impact on internal validity, in other words, systematic error, then that gets confusing. So that's focused, and we'll get some experience looking at the focused aspect of the Newcastle Ottawa scale, and when we try that out in a moment. The second principle is that the appraisal should be extensive, meaning that all relevant components of the construct of interest have to be included. So in other words, if we're interested in internal validity, we need to be sure that all types of bias that could be relevant to our study design of interest are captured in the appraisal. Now, that is actually quite a challenge, unless you happen to be an expert on bias and an expert on study designs. This can be quite difficult. So that's something to think quite carefully about. But nevertheless, the tool has to be able to be extensive in order to appropriately inform the data synthesis. So the sort of issues that might come up with regarding the extensiveness of a critical appraisal tool could be that certain types of bias are missing entirely. So we are interested in internal validity. We've got a critical appraisal tool that claims to measure the risk of bias, but actually it doesn't contain all of the questions that you need to assess all of the types of bias that you expect to find for that study design. And we know for a fact that some environmental systematic reviews just don't include attrition bias at all in their assessments. Attrition bias is about whether there are missing data. This has just been missed out of a number of systematic reviews. So that's an example of where the extensive aspect of the critical appraisal is compromised. As I said, it's actually quite challenging to know what types of bias you would expect to find in a study. And so this is hopefully going to be something that we get a bit of a grip on this afternoon. The third principle applied, obviously, as I said, the appraisal must inform the data synthesis in an appropriate way. So it's got to provide an output that is useful to inform the data synthesis. So that's using some kind of appropriate output scale in a way that then can be operationalized in the data synthesis, such as in a sensitivity analysis or a subgroup analysis, or some kind of bias correction. There are various different ways that you can actually incorporate internal validity assessments in the data synthesis, provided that the critical appraisal tool you use gives you the right output. So that's what the application is about. And some of the issues that could come up with the application is that different types of bias could be mixed together in one scale. And within a particular type of bias, the rating scale that you use to judge the risk of that bias, so for example, a low risk, or moderate risk, or a high risk, that scale may be misinterpreted. So it's an ordinal scale, but it might be interpreted as continuous. So then you end up with people calculating numerical operations and statistics from it, which is not appropriate. Another issue with the output of critical appraisal tools is that sometimes they recommend the use of summary scores, which on the face of it sounds like a good idea, because bringing things down into simple, convenient numbers is quite appealing. But the key problem is we get with summary scores is that they conceal useful information. You lose information on where the problems are in a study. So if a study is subject to multiple risks of bias and you end up with one summary score that doesn't separate them, then you lose useful information about how to interpret that study and how to progress science if you don't know what the limitations of science are. So those are the first three principles, and the final one is that the critical appraisal tool needs to be transparent, or the whole critical appraisal process needs to be transparent, but by definition the tool itself also needs to be transparent. And the issues with transparency that can come up with are that you have a critical appraisal tool that doesn't require you to record and justify your decisions. This is important because there's a lot of subjectivity in critical appraisal, and so transparency about how you reach your decision, how you decided that there was a risk of bias in this study is absolutely crucial. And sometimes the output of critical appraisal tools isn't particularly intuitive. The link between the questions in the tool and whether there is a risk of bias or not is not very clear. So you may have a yes/no output to questions in critical appraisal tools. Well, what does that actually mean in terms of the risk of bias? And we'll have a look at this when we come to the Newcastle scale in a moment. So that is a quick summary of what these four key principles are about, making sure that we have a clear focus. So in our case, we're interested in systematic reviews, so that's internal validity. We're making sure that we are adequately extensive in capturing all components of internal validity. So we need to make sure we have all the sources of bias accounted for that are relevant to our study design of interest. And then we must make sure that the output of our critical appraisal can inform the data synthesis appropriately, and then that the whole process is adequately transparent. Okay, so we're going to now have a look at the Newcastle scale against these FEAT principles to see how well the NOS does. And just to remind you, the reason we've chosen the NOS Newcastle scale is because it is the most popular critical appraisal tool for observational studies. So the first thing to say, I just mentioned that we assessed selected the Newcastle scale there because it's the most widely used tool. The Newcastle scale has actually got two versions. One is for appraising cohort studies and the other is for case control studies. Now, just to keep things manageable this afternoon, we're going to focus on using the cohort studies version of the Newcastle scale as an example. Now, the Newcastle scale tools are available from a website, which is here. And at that website, you will find a slide presentation which briefly goes through the tool and how to score the tool, and an example of the output, which we'll show you in a moment. There's a Word and PDF version of the manual, and there's a Word and PDF version of the checklist, or the Newcastle scale checklist. So this is all available from a website, and that may be is why it's widely used. It's readily available, readily accessible. So the scale itself is a long checklist. Oh, I say long, it's kind of slightly annoyingly long to not quite fit on a PowerPoint slide, but it actually only has 8 questions. So it's a checklist with 8 questions, and it's divided into 3 sections. So there's a section about selection, comparability, and the outcome in a cohort study. And in a moment, we'll just have a quick recap of what a cohort study is in case we're not clear about that. There are 2 or 3 statements per question relating to study design, and you essentially need to choose the statement that best matches the study design that you are interested in. And then the answer to these questions comes in the form of a star, and questions can be awarded a maximum of 1 or 2 stars, depending on the question. So selection questions have a maximum of 1 star. The question on comparability here has a maximum of 2 stars it can be awarded, and the outcome questions have a maximum of 1 star that they can be awarded. And the overall output of this sort of scoring exercise with stars, if you like, is to give you an overall assessment of the study quality. Okay, so that's how this Newcastle Ottawa Scale checklist for cohort studies works. So let's just go back and remind ourselves about the FEAT criteria and have a look at whether or not the Newcastle Ottawa Scale for cohort studies does align with these core principles for critical appraisal. So this slide looks a bit cluttered, but it's essentially what we've got here. We've got the 8 questions here, divided into the 3 sections which I mentioned, so selection, comparability, and outcome. Now, there isn't time really for us to sort of go through every question one by one and start discussing all the possible sources of bias that or threats to internal validity that could occur. But if you were to look at this scale, this checklist in detail, you would see that all of the questions here relate to certain aspects of internal validity. So they are valid questions. They are legitimate questions to ask about different types of bias that could occur in a cohort study. Now, you might not want to take our word for that. You're very welcome to go away and look at this tool in more detail. But this is just we're illustrating how you would go about assessing a critical appraisal tool against the FEAT principles. So that's what we're trying to illustrate here. There is a slight difference. There's a slight deviation here in that the first question in the Newcastle Ottawa Scale for cohort studies asks us about the representativeness of the exposed cohort, which is actually really a question about external validity. So it's whether the cohort in your cohort study matches the wider population of interest, of relevance to the review question. So strictly speaking, this is a question about external validity, not internal validity. Now, you may decide that that's not a problem because external validity relates to systematic error and needs to be assessed, and as does internal validity. But that's just an example of where the Newcastle Ottawa Scale doesn't quite totally cover internal validity. So in all the other questions, we believe that internal validity has been assessed, but this question assesses external validity. So it does pretty well on the focus part of FEAT. So we get a fairly big tick for the F, I think. There's certainly nothing really alarming going on here. So that's how you'd rate a critical appraisal tool against focus. Is it focused on internal validity? Yes, largely yes. So what about the extensive component? Now that we know that the Newcastle Ottawa Scale does address internal validity, does it actually capture internal validity adequately? Now, in order to answer that question, we need to take a step back and just remind ourselves what a cohort study is, because what we need to do in order to answer the extensive question is to decide whether or not all of the possible sources of bias that could come up in a cohort study are captured in the tool. And this is where things start to get a bit complicated and fiddly. And, there's no escaping this. It's just life, that this is how critical appraisal works. We do need to have some knowledge of study designs and risks of bias. So Excuse me while I go back one step and remind us what a cohort study is. A cohort study is a study where we have essentially one population that we are interested in following to understand whether outcomes of interest occur in individuals in that population who are either exposed or not exposed to a particular intervention or exposure situation. So you're following basically a population through time. So that's essentially what a cohort study is. It's following a population through time. There will be exposures in that time period, and then the time period ends with the population having or not having the outcome of interest. That's the simplest description of a cohort study. Now, just for a reference, it's useful to have a kind of question in mind, a systematic review question in mind when thinking about study designs. So the Newcastle Scale website does actually pose a systematic review question. So we've gone with that just in the illustration slide here. So the question is asking whether or not cardiovascular events differ between post-menopausal women who have received hormone replacement therapy or not. So that's actually a PICO type question, and it's very amenable to a cohort study design. So this slide is really just to remind us what a cohort study is. So that's the first thing we need to be clear about before looking at critical appraisal tools. What is the study design that we are including in our systematic review, and is the critical appraisal tool appropriate for that? Just to mention that cohort studies can be prospective or retrospective. In a prospective cohort study, you recruit a population and follow that through time. In a retrospective study, the population has already been recruited and followed through time in history, and the data are available in some place like a database or a patient registry, and you're going back to those data. I'm just mentioning that because there are different risks of bias in prospective and retrospective studies, so that's something to think about. So anyway, we've got the Newcastle Scale, which claims to be useful for cohort studies. We already know that it does target internal validity, which is good. And so what we need to know now is, does it cover all the kinds of bias that you might expect to find in this kind of cohort study? So this is where things get interesting, and this is where you might want to go and meet with colleagues and have a coffee and say, well, what are the kinds of bias that you can find in a cohort study? So a cohort study could suffer from different types of selection bias. So, for example, if the cohort is not representative of the target population, actually, this is something that we called external validity in the example just now.
I think this, Geoff, would be relating to sampling more than so whether or not your sample from your target population is representative.
But the key point here on this slide is just to point out that there are actually multiple different sources of bias that can occur. In fact, quite a few when you look at it in a cohort study. So the population characteristics, or the baseline characteristics of the two cohorts, the exposed and unexposed cohorts of people within the population of interest, they need to be similar. Otherwise, a confounding variable might explain the outcome. So, obviously, if the exposed cohort has a different age to the unexposed cohort, then that's a confounding factor that might explain the outcome rather than HRT, which is what we're interested in. So that's an example. There could be missing data between these cohorts that's not balanced. So that's a risk of attrition bias. There's a possibility in cohort studies that the exposure condition is misclassified. It's not correctly defined. And then you've got risk of biases in detection of the outcome. So how the outcome is measured. And these will differ according to what kind of outcome. So in this example with coronary heart disease, you could be interested in measuring mortality due to coronary heart disease. You could be interested in whether people experience angina. You could be interested in whether you've got radiological evidence of narrowing of the coronary artery. There's different kinds of outcome that would all need to be checked separately for their risk of bias. And then outcome reporting bias is also a potential problem. So having got an outcome, has it been properly reported? So, if it's a continuous outcome, it's been reported as a continuous outcome, not sort of sliced up into dichotomous data or ordinal data or something like that. So there's different ways that outcomes can be reported that can introduce bias that might apply. And then the partiality and the overall analysis. Do the people doing the overall analysis, like the statisticians, are they aware of the allocation groups of participants, or essentially who was exposed and who wasn't exposed? So did the statistical analysis differ in any way between exposed and non-exposed groups? So these are just examples of the things you need to think about. And some of these are very familiar types of bias, selection bias we come across a lot. And some of them may be a bit more specific to these types of cohort study, for example, misclassification of the exposure. So these are things to keep in mind when we look at the critical appraisal tools that we are interested in potentially using. Are all of these types of bias going to be covered?
Geoff, we just have a very quick question in the chat that seems quite relevant, actually.
Yeah.
So we don't need to digress too hard, but Stevie has asked, he says that he doesn't have the expertise to define all possible sources of bias. That's fine. None of us do, right? Yeah. He doubts that many researchers have come up with all relevant possible sources of bias. So what sources or tips do we have to be comprehensive in doing the bias, kind of defining the domains or types of bias that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And if we had a perfect answer to that question, we could all go home and enjoy ourselves. One of the reasons we got this workshop is because we don't have a very good answer. So it's a little bit like a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? We're talking about selecting critical appraisal tools. And if you had a really good fit for purpose critical appraisal tool that was based on causality theory and empirically supported in that way, you might trust that tool to guide you on all of the types of bias that you need to know, in which case you wouldn't really need to worry too much. When you join a systematic review team, you'd be given this guidance from the tools. That might be the case for certain tools, like, for example, those developed by Cochrane are very strongly based in empirical theory of causality. So, these tools do give us some confidence. Once you look at randomized control trials, we do have strong confidence that we know most of the types of bias that they're likely to be susceptible to. Once we go down the list of, the hierarchy of evidence into the observational studies area, and especially if you get hybrid study designs where you get mixed types of observational or even quasi-experimental studies, it gets much more murky. What we would recommend, I think, and this is where it might be worth you having a look at the paper in environmental evidence where we introduce the FEAT principles. We recommend a kind of systematic way of working through this when developing a systematic review protocol. So one of the things you can do is you can have a stakeholder engagement exercise with topic experts and possibly experts in causality theory, such as statisticians or statisticians or mathematicians. So stakeholders, engage with stakeholders to work out whether anybody has spotted a source of bias or confounding that hasn't been found. It can be very helpful to develop conceptual models. So you can sketch out what is the dependent variable, what is the independent variable, what is the exposure pathway. Sketch that out and discuss that, send that to your advisory group, your stakeholder group, use that as a focus of discussion. Even put it on, you could, if we had the time, you could even put it out for peer review. That's one of the functions of developing a protocol and having it peer reviewed in a systematic review. The other thing that you can do is an extension of conceptual models is to look at directed acyclic graphs, which are a way of formally investigating the relationships between dependent and independent variables and where and clearly specifying where confounding could occur. Okay, so there's a sort of structured process of trying to make sure you've covered your bases, if you like. And if you go through that process of consulting with experts, making sure you're clear what your conceptual model is, what your logic model is for your systematic review question, and making sure that you don't think you've missed any types of confounding, then your systematic review report is likely to be quite strongly defensible. But clearly, even having gone through that process, there might be sources of error that nobody's thought of that would be missed. But that would definitely be an improvement in the sort of level of rigor that people currently conduct, I think, for many systematic reviews. I don't know if that's answered your question enough. I mean, I wish I could give you a perfect answer. Is anything to add, Paul?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's all of that. You know, where as a naturally incredibly lazy person, there are also some tools that have fairly robust development processes behind them. So you couldn't be blamed, for example, for taking Robbins I or Robbins E if you're looking at non-randomized studies of interventions or exposures, because that's been well worked out over like 15 to 20 years of experience by the Bristol set, right, in evidence-based medicine. There's not going to be a huge amount that's missing from that. And in using tools like Robbins, like per protocol, they would say you'd have to sit down and carefully work through the potential confounders and things with an expert group of epidemiologists working in that topic space. And then you're pretty good. I mean, this stuff is really tough because in some domains, these issues are quite well understood and there are tools that are quite well established and that work quite well. The challenge that I think, one of the challenges that Geoff and I are trying to address in developing the FEAT framework is that the well-developed tools tend to be rarely used, and there's a lot of use of tools that are less well-developed. So what we're trying to do, I think, if you apply the FEAT framework and you kind of, you know, you can quickly see there are issues in with issues in the Newcastle scale, and you apply the FEAT framework to something like Robbins, you'll see that the issues with the Newcastle scale just aren't there with Robbins. And there's no such thing as a perfect assessment or a perfect tool. It's about understanding what the tool does and its limitations within the context of the systematic review you're trying to do. You have a good handle on that, you've done a good job, basically.
Great, good answer. Okay, thanks for the question. That was great. It's quite challenging to cover critical appraisal in a 1.5 hours workshop. You know, it's amazing we can actually address it in full, given how complex it is. So,
actually, on the subject of that, Geoff, we've got 30 minutes.
That's fine. I think it's fine. So just to recap, because we did a slight diversion there to answer the question. Yeah, so we have got to the point where in order to understand whether a critical appraisal tool is adequately extensive to fully capture internal validity, we need to know what the internal validity issues are in the study design that we're looking at. And so as we just discussed, there's a lot of them. So does the Newcastle scale address these main types of bias that we would, you know, not be surprised to find in a cohort study? So the answer in very quick summary form is it doesn't. So these highlighted types of bias are either not captured at all in the Newcastle scale for cohort studies, or they're not fully captured. So you know, we could take this scale and discuss it for hours and hours. It's you know, it's quite a complex area, critical appraisal, but basically we've looked at each of these questions. Paul and I have looked at them and decided between ourselves that we don't think that these or we don't think these are actually relating to bias, i.e. internal validity. And the output of our assessment is that yes, selection bias is well covered. Unbalanced missing data, that's reasonably well covered. Misclassification of the exposure or outcome does appear to be covered, and detection biases appear to be covered. Some types of confounding are covered in the questions, but there aren't any specific questions that would address bias in the way that outcomes are reported, and there aren't any questions that would check whether there's any partiality in the analysts of the study. So in this sense, in our assessment, the Newcastle scale does actually miss some key types of bias that we would hope to have assessed a study for, a cohort study. Okay, so already, even though this might not be an exhaustive list of biases that we started with, we can already see that some types of bias that we would expect to be assessed are not assessed by this scale. Okay, so that's how Newcastle Ottawa rates against the extensive principle. So let's look at how the Newcastle Ottawa scale for cohort studies rates against the applied principle. So this is taken from the Newcastle Ottawa Scale's website, the slideshow presentation at the website, and it's an example of we think how the Newcastle Ottawa Scale developers anticipate that the tool output would be used. So the output is a summary from the star answers to the questions for each of the categories of selection, comparability, and outcome sections of the checklist. And you can see that in this particular review that this is based on, there were 14 studies, 14 cohort studies. And so this gives us a summary of how each of these studies compared regarding these three sort of sections, three domains of the Newcastle Ottawa scale. But there are some key things to note here. Obviously, when you remember back to how we answered the questions in the Newcastle Ottawa scale, some of the questions were allowed to have 1-star maximum answer. And the comparability question was the only one that was permitted a maximum of 2 stars. But there was only one comparability question and there were 4 selection questions. So you can immediately see that these are not directly comparable against each other in terms of the kind of quantity of stars. Within each category, certainly there's a relative comparison you can make on how the studies perform, but you can't compare across categories. And so that's something to think about in the output. So how can we apply this in a data synthesis? Can this appropriately inform data synthesis? And this is another example from the Newcastle Ottawa Scale website itself. And they've suggested that you can literally tabulate these star outcomes against your data synthesis output, which in this case is a standard forest plot. And this looks actually like, it's quite informative. It does tell us that there are differences in aspects of rigour between these studies. And as we already know that the Newcastle Ottawa scale does target internal validity, we might actually go so far as to say, well, there might be some differences in internal validity between these studies shown by this output. The problem is that, as I said, these are not comparable scales because they're not numeric scales in the sense you can just add up the number of stars. So you can't just, for example, say that the Lauritsen study has 7 stars and therefore it's better than the Palatini study, which has 6 stars. Unfortunately, this is exactly how people use the output of the Newcastle Ottawa scale in most cases, as far as we're aware. So the scale could potentially have a maximum number of 9 points if you regard a star as a point. And people have used this to come up with a scale of 1 to 9 to then try and interpret that in terms of some kind of risk of bias interpretation, which doesn't make much sense. What is is this actually useful for the data synthesis? It's partly useful in that we can see some patterns, but there's a real danger that you're going to end up summing these up and giving an output that has nothing to actually do with risk of bias. So that's not a fully appropriate output to see for a critical appraisal. Okay. The question we really want to know, if we're going to conduct data synthesis, is how susceptible to bias is each study. So just for example, we've got a Peliti study here and the Lafferty study. We can see from the way these stars are organized on this against this forest plot that the Peliti study has some issues with selection and outcome related biases, whereas the Lafferty study doesn't have those issues, but it does have some other issues with comparability of the cohort. And as I mentioned, the adding up of scores is the real problem with this type of output from a critical appraisal tool. So you might think that Peliti scores 6 out of 9 compared to Lafferty 8 out of 9. that just doesn't mean anything in terms of risk of bias, does it? So we do need a different way of rating the output from this particular tool. Now, it's not to say that the Newcastle Ottawa scale is a disaster. I mean, it does assess some key parts of internal validity, but maybe it needs to be modified. So the FEAT criteria could actually be quite useful when looking at critical appraisal tools, identifying where the tools might be deficient and might need to be modified, as long as you have the permission to modify tools. So certain tools might have copyright restrictions we have to be careful of, but you could potentially form a new tool from the good parts of the Newcastle Ottawa scale. So anyway, finally, is the Newcastle Ottawa scale transparent? Does it meet the basic principle of transparency? No, unfortunately, because the tool doesn't ask us to provide any rationale for our judgments that we make. So it might ask us whether the cohorts are comparable on their baseline characteristics. But if we just say yes or no or select a star, that doesn't tell us why we made that decision. Is it because they differ in age? Is it because some of them have a different disease history? That information could be crucial for understanding how to interpret the data and is just missing. So that's why recording judgments about risk of bias decisions is so important. And this is something that the Cochrane tools do require people to do. So just to, before we have we finish off and open up for a discussion, it's worth saying, obviously, the FEAT principles can be applied to any critical appraisal tools. We've just used the Newcastle Ottawa scale as an example because it is so widely used. But there is an example in the environmental evidence paper where we've applied the tool to the JBI critical appraisal tool for cohort studies and another tool called the OHAT risk of bias tool for cohort studies. These are just examples. And you can see that an overall summary in this table shows that these tools generally do target internal validity quite well. So that's not really an issue, but they start to fall down on whether they adequately capture internal validity. So, we're really interested in risk of bias, but actually these tools aren't capturing all of the risks of bias, with the exception perhaps of the OHAT tool, which does seem to cover most of the types of bias that we would expect. But you could go away and look at OHAT and you may disagree with us, given that we've had this discussion about how can we ever be sure about this. So that's, that's open to some interpretation. The application of the tools varies. So the final rating we just discussed with Newcastle Ottawa is a total score which can conceal important differences between the studies. In the JBI tool for cohort studies, the output is a series of yes, no, or unclear answers. But these don't directly translate into internal validity. They don't directly translate into, yes, there's a high or a low risk of bias that you can immediately operationalize in the data synthesis. The OHAT tool is better. It's got some stronger signaling questions that seem to link through to logical risk of bias judgments. And as for transparency, again, the similar problems that we've talked about, Newcastle Ottawa and the JBI tools don't expect the review team to record any judgments about why they decided a study was at high or low risk of bias or not. Whereas the OHAT tool, and as I say, the Cochrane tools as well, do ask for this information. So that's just a summary table, just to show you how you can kind of, rate the FEAT principles against these tools, or rate these tools against the FEAT principles. And hopefully this table gives you, a feel for why having these 4 principles, just saying, focused, extensive, applied, transparent, these are 4 key things to look for, is quite powerful, rather than having a 90 question checklist that goes into all the bowels of critical appraisal, which you could also apply to assess critical appraisal tools. So to recap, I hope that this has given you an understanding of the FEAT principles, why we've come up with them, why, I mean, the principles already exist. We haven't come up with the principles, but what we've done is we've phrased them as a short, memorable acronym so that it makes life easier. That's basically what we've done. So do you understand the FEAT principles? If you don't understand, please pop something in the chat thread and we can pick that up. And hopefully this little exercise, just focusing on the Newcastle Ottawa scale for cohort studies, is a good illustration how we have to be careful when we come across critical appraisal tools. We shouldn't just take them at face value. We need to do a critique of the critical appraisal tool, really. That's something that you would want to do in the protocol development stage of a systematic review. Be sure that you have selected appropriate tools. So hopefully today that's helped you to be a bit more wary perhaps of critical appraisal tools. And also to understand this, where these limitations are in relation to the types of internal validity threat that we would be interested in looking at. So hopefully those learning objectives we can put a tick by. But if you feel that you haven't, understood what we're talking about, or there's something deficient that you'd like some clarification on, do put something in the chat so we can pick that up. So now there is an opportunity, actually. I don't know how much time we've got left, Paul. Are we okay?
We've got 20 minutes and we have a few questions that are good questions we can dig into. So
brilliant. So I did kind of rush through that reasonably quickly just to make sure we didn't have no time left at the end. Shall we mention, before we take questions, shall we mention about the possible involvement in future activities, or should we do that after?
No, let's do that now, because we've got this.
If you remember, this is a long time ago now, but if you remember at the beginning, we said there could be an opportunity for you to contribute with us to a manuscript if you're interested. So we've explained what the FEAT principles are. So we've tried to explain them to you, and I don't know how well we did. Maybe we didn't do a particularly good job, or maybe it was okay. But we think that probably it could be beneficial to produce a guidance document or a sort of user guide or manual to publish, to explain what the FEAT principles are to people. So obviously get some uptake. So, I mean, as Paul said, it's a little bit biased, the way these principles are being used at the moment, because they've been adopted by the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which I'm involved in, and the journals that Paul's been involved in. So we've got a bit of a vested interest in those examples. But, if we feel collectively as a workshop that these are useful principles that are worth disseminating, then probably we need to disseminate them further than we are here, with something a bit more explanatory than we put in the environmental evidence paper. So the environmental evidence paper that I explained about covers the whole of critical appraisal, how to plan and conduct critical appraisal. It's got a fairly small section explaining FEAT principles, although they are important. So there could be a role for let's say, user guide or a guidance document or something. And this is where we might want to consider, sub questions within FEAT, whether we develop a bigger checklist to more appropriately make sure that people don't miss things that are relevant to FEAT. The danger, of course, is that we end up with something like a consort list or a Prisma list, which goes on forever, and people, just don't want to fill in or don't want to use, because I get allergic to checklists, and that's why I wanted FEAT to be so intuitive and simple. So you keep it in your head almost. But is it useful to have a checklist to support it that may be optional, or to make sure that the items are all applied appropriately? I don't know. This is an open question. This is where we really like your feedback, and if you're interested, and if you'd like to join in putting something together, having a discussion around where to go next. So we would organise some meetings, Teams or Zoom or Google Meet or something, wouldn't we, Paul? I think, to pick this up. Yeah. Do you want to say anything more about this?
I just think that this is an ideal opportunity. So people who are new to this, we're still learning to talk about it and how to write about it and how to teach about it. So having people who've been on the receiving end of, is this our first proper FEAT presentation that we've done?
Yeah.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah. So I think everyone who's in this call is ideal potential co-author, just to help shape that kind of guidance manuscript. And your contributions be really welcome. So just drop Geoff or I an email afterwards, and we'll get back to you about when we're going to have our first call about it and start working something up.
Yeah, so there are our details. And just before we talk about pick up the chat, just to let you know that at the end of this presentation are the references. So if you're watching this retrospectively on YouTube, you can scroll down a bit further and you'll see all the references for everything we've said above. So Neil, sorry, Neil, not Neil, Paul, or Neil, in fact, whoever's monitoring the chat, anybody, what are the questions?
So I've got the chat in front of me. We've got an interesting question about rapid reviews, but I think we'll just loop back around to that because it opens up a broader issue, I think, than what FEAT is necessarily designed to address. Someone asked if we've already identified tools that tick most or all of the boxes of FEAT. There are quite a lot of quite good tools out there. So I dropped in the chat tools like Robin's Eye, Robin's E, Rob2, USNTP OHAT that was in one of our examples. The navigation guide in the environmental health space have a perfectly serviceable risk of bias assessment tool. The original Higgins 2009 Rob tool is, I think the reasoning that went into Rob2 is valid and sound, but it doesn't invalidate the previous generation of Cochrane risk of bias tools. And now that actually you reminded me about it, so the Joanna Briggs Institute tool that you had in your slide, they updated it since we wrote the critical appraisal paper together, and the new version of the Joanna Briggs Institute, which I think came out maybe as recently as 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago or something, it actually addresses a lot of the issues that we would identify through FEAT in that original JBI tool, and the new tool actually resolves a lot of those issues.
Does it? That's interesting, because I very briefly tried to look at the new tool because I was aware it had been updated. And the version I looked at, which I thought was the updated version, still didn't address some of those issues. So I think I must have accidentally looked at the old version. Thinking
they have a lot of tools. So it might be that they've done a better job in addressing the issues in the RCT's tool than they did in the Cohort tool. I've not looked at them in detail. I just had a quick browse through and I was like, this is looking much stronger than they used to anyway.
Right. So when I looked at what I thought I'd done was look at the latest version of the Cohort tool. And I thought, if I'd done that correctly, that it hadn't really addressed the issues. But this is something that we can all go away and look at. So this is
look at it. Yep.
It's a nice little exercise to go and see whether the latest JBI tool actually does address the FEAT principles. So don't take our word for it. Have a look, maybe. Good little exercise.
So then Matthew pulled a good question from Slack, which I didn't see. So someone says, and again, this is more of an issue relating to publishing practices as much as anything else. So they said that they think one of the main limitations in the FEAT framework is incorporating word limits in journals. And they say that in their experience of systematic review publishing, they struggle with word limits. So when they want to fully discuss problematic risk of bias domains in their included studies, they're basically not allowed to by the journal. And speaking as an editor, I think this is just one example of how badly wrong we're getting publishing with word limits, right? It's the internet. We don't publish on paper anymore. There is no reason to have word limits at journals. Every journal I've worked at has abandoned word limits for systematic reviews the moment I walk through the door. My new journal has no word limits on anything at all. There are no figure limits. It's completely and utterly absurd. So if you've got journals requiring stupid stuff, my advice is publish somewhere else. That's how you solve that problem.
Yeah. The downside of having no word limits, of course, is if you're a peer reviewer, you can be sent a systematic review that's 85 pages long with 12 supplementary.
Okay, that's also, so just to give the other side of stupid, right? There are some journals that are totally stupid and don't require authors to be concise, which is also a problem. So the guidance for my journal and sensible journals is use as many words as you need, but be as concise as possible, right? So you evaluate it from both sides. Yeah, so if you get an 85-page systematic review, obviously a different mistake has been made. But yeah, hard word limits are ridiculous.
Yeah, so it's the other way around, isn't it? It's not that the journal, the problem with the FEAT principles has been identified. It's a problem with the journal that's been identified by the FEAT principles.
So then we've got, Heather Schaefer says that they find that environmental health research has a considerable pool of cross-sectional studies. Do you happen to know if Newcastle Scale or others have strong tools specific to address the biases of the use of cross-sectional studies and how to use cross-sectional studies in an applied context considering these biases. Geoff, you can have that one.
Well, the simple answer is, if I can only answer this in a way that how I would approach it, because I don't personally know of a tool that I would say is very strong in this area. Now that doesn't mean there isn't a tool, so please don't take my word for there might be a tool out there. I would systematically consider, based on my own knowledge of study designs and sources of systematic error, I would work through what type of cross-sectional study I am conducting, and I try and identify what types of bias I would expect to need to consider. And then I would look for some, I would do an up-to-date search on the latest cross-sectional study tools, of which there are actually quite a few that claim to cover cross-sectional studies. Newcastle Scale, I don't think it strictly covers cross-sectional studies, although there is some wording in there that implies that you can use the case control tool for cross-sectional studies. I'm not quite sure. But JBI tool, the JBI has one for cross-sectional studies and so on. What I would do is I would try and get some idea of what I'm actually looking for in my cross-sectional study. So once I'm clear about that, I will then look for tools that match based on that sort of stepwise procedure that I talked about. So that's make sure that I personally am confident that the types of bias that I'm expecting that could come up, I can assess. I would hopefully, if I have time, ask other people, other experts, send my ideas around, or ask the rest of the team. If it's a project with an advisory board, ask them. And then if necessary, this is the point at which you might potentially identify the need to make a new tool or a bespoke tool or adapt an existing tool. So for example, if the JBI tool for cross-sectional studies doesn't cover some aspects or bias that could arise from your specific setting for that cross-sectional study, then you might make a case for using that tool with some adaptation, add some extra questions in, something like that. We cover this systematic, so structured way of dealing with this problem. If you don't know if the tools are adequate or if they exist to properly address your question, we cover this systematic sort of process, which I mentioned, stakeholder engagement, conceptual model, directed cyclic graphs, looking around at the different tools. That's in the paper in environmental evidence. We just list those steps there. So now you caught me out, because I don't know of a specific tool that I would say off the top of my head is, this is the go-to. Not like the ones that Paul has mentioned for other study designs. So Paul, you mentioned you'd be quite confident using Robbins I, Robbins E, of Rob2, OHAP, things like that. I can't say the same for cross-sectional studies.
Yes, the reason I gave you that question is I didn't have a good answer, and I was
I just kind of
preserve my reputation by saying nothing at all.
No, but this is a really good example. This is a really good example of where we can go away. And I probably need to do this now, because you asked me the question. I probably need to go away with the FEAT principles and actually look at a few cross-sectional study tools and see which ones are good, because this is a really good question. I didn't really know what the answer is to that without.
Cross-sectional studies are tricky to deal with anyway, because you're measuring exposure at the same time as outcome typically. So there are ways of designing them and certain types of exposure and outcome that they're better suited to understanding, and then types of outcome which might have exposure which might be very short-lived, where the present level of exposure isn't indicative of historical levels of exposure, would be more challenging, right? But it's like anything, so you have to take it in context.
Absolutely. That is a great example of the kind of discussion that you would have with expert stakeholders. So for example, if I want to conduct a cross-sectional study, I think I'll have a Teams call with you, and you can tell me all about those issues you're just talking about. That's a good part of the process. Okay.
So we had the question about rapid reviews, because again, I think this segues nicely, because we're talking about context suddenly. And when people say, is it justifiable to do such and such, then it largely depends on context, right? Have you got the good reasons for doing so? So I'm just trying to find the question now. So Joseph Langridge asks, if one is undertaking a rapid review, being extensive may be difficult. Is it justifiable to accelerate the critical appraisal process by leaving out certain types of bias and therefore compromising extensiveness?
That is a really good question. And it's a very general question about where do we need to do critical appraisal in the spectrum of reviews. So you go all the way from a fully fledged systematic review, which is very intensive, but designed to give you a very reliable output, down to the other end of the scale where you need to do a rapid synthesis. And the answer to that question depends on why you need to do a rapid synthesis. So, you know, the very far end of that rapid scale is like you need an emergency answer to a question in 2 hours. If you need to do a review that's that rapid, then clearly you can't do a full critical appraisal. You need to just gather evidence together. Okay. If you are conducting a rapid review that's not quite that far along the scale, and you have some justification for doing the review rapidly rather than more systematically, then I think ideally you do need to at least consider whether or not critical appraisal, whether it's acceptable to exclude critical appraisal, because at the moment, most rapid reviews don't even consider critical appraisal. So there have been various surveys done recently which show that critical appraisal is just essentially ignored in rapid reviews, which is a problem. If you are doing a rapid review of a fuzzy question that's not going to give you a hard quantitative data point that's important, then maybe your risk of bias is not such a strong consideration. It depends on what, you know, how important is the quantitative output of your evidence review. Is it going to inform a model parameter? Is it going to go directly into a guideline? Is it going to inform a policy committee discussion? What is it going to do? And is it, you know, in medicine, maybe it's really crucial that your output, you know, how effective is a cancer drug, is you've really got to be certain about that. But it depends. If you've got more of a fuzzy policy question, you might get away with not being quite so concerned about some aspects of the critical appraisal. So this is intrinsically linked with why you're doing the review rapidly in the first place. You've got to be able to justify that, and why, and what your question is. How sensitive is your question going to be to systematic error? Okay, and does it matter? If it's not a critical question, it might not matter. So if that's the case, then you might be able to make a case for not doing critical appraisal at all. But what I would say is don't ignore it. Just put a sentence in your protocol explaining why you aren't doing critical appraisal. It's important to justify your position. But the other thing is that this is something that we're quite interested in potentially developing further, if anyone's interested, is whether something like FEAT could be a useful framework or checklist for rapid reviews. Because when you are doing a rapid review, as the question correctly, hits the nail on the head here, which, if you're going to do a critical appraisal, which bit do you miss out if you've got to do a rapid synthesis? And so having a framework where you say, well, okay, we critical appraisal is structured. We definitely know that we've got to assess internal validity for this particular review question. But can we miss out some types of bias? So that's where you're prompted by the extensive question. And then the question was about which ones can we miss out? Well, we don't have an answer to that specific question, but we know that we've got to ask that question. And we know that in developing the protocol for that rapid review, you will have had to have gone through this thought process and justified that you're not going to assess, maybe attrition bias. And you can put a justification for that, because maybe the kinds of studies that you're including in that rapid review don't suffer from attrition bias because of inherent features of the design or something. So yeah, I think a structure could be really helpful. But it's a really good question. Does that answer it in any way? Anything to add, Paul?
I think answered very well. We've got 2 more questions from YouTube that we should try and just wedge in the last 2 minutes. And then I just want to also mention something that a couple of people from the questions might be interested in, because it relates to how do you catalog bias. So first question from YouTube is, do you ever make inferences on the degree of impact a bias has on the point estimates? And the answer to that question is, it depends, because it's very difficult to generate empirical evidence of the magnitude of bias that is introduced by some shortcoming or limitation in study design. So in one experimental context, blinding or masking might have a trivial effect. Often if the outcome is very objective, like mortality, then you're not going to worry too much about masking. But in other contexts, you've got a subjective outcome that's being evaluated, then not masking investigators to exposure status could be very, very important. And then developing evidence for that particular study design, how important masking is, might be very difficult to do, if not impossible. So what we generally do is we have some kind of heuristics, rules of thumb that we follow, where we try to understand how worried we are based on the information we have about the subjectivity of the measurement, or it's the potential importance of something, but we wouldn't usually try to adjust a point estimate around potential magnitude of bias, because it's so hard to establish whether or not that adjustment would be correct. As we get bigger data sets and things, it becomes more possible to do some of this stuff, but we approach that very, very cautiously.
Yeah, it's a difficult area. I went to an EFSA colloquium a few years ago and there was a session about bias adjustment methods, and I left that session thinking, this is nothing to go on at the moment. It's a very niche area where there are statistical methods available that you can apply, but they're very much applicable to very specific situations. There's no general approach that we could suggest, I don't think, at the moment.
Okay, so I have 60 seconds left, so I just want to quickly answer. So Huzaifa Imam, and apologies for my pronunciation, asks if the limit of NOS is that you can sum up the individual ratings and compare the sums between studies, and hence decide which study has a higher risk of bias. That is one of several problems. So generally adding up across bias domains is a bad idea that we have run out of time to explain in detail. But there's some good guidance in the Cochrane handbook on why you shouldn't do that. Good theoretical reason for not doing. And then the final thing I wanted to mention, which I think particularly relates to Stevie's question, is that there's a project called the Scientific Evidence Code System that I'm involved in, where we are running through trying to develop a controlled vocabulary for health research. And that includes 140 different risk of bias terms and types. We meet once a week on Fridays to do the consensus process for defining these terms. So if anyone wanted to be involved in that, it is an open project. People volunteer to participate. Drop me an email and I will tell you more about it.
Thank you so much for that brilliant workshop. I really enjoyed that. I hope everyone also enjoyed it as well. I've learned so much. I'm going to definitely contact you two guys and hopefully try and contribute to this project. It's very interesting. Yeah, I hope everyone's enjoying the whole process, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.